have remembered you all this time and been so happy to keep in touch, and you're doing amazing work now too. You were a global law scholar here, and are really, I think, blazing a trail in this field of law and technology. And so you wrote about something that is very near and dear to me, the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, this new agreement that is really taking shape on the African continent. 54 countries are a party to this agreement, and it started out with an initial framework and is now adding these new protocols in areas that are relevant to your paper: intellectual property, competition, and investment. Those were finalized last year, and now a new protocol on digital trade and a protocol on gender and youth, which I know is not the focus of your paper, but just wanted to mention that too. That is also coming out imminently. And you looked at this as this tremendous opportunity, right? A way to really bring technological innovation and economic prosperity to the continent, and a way to learn from other legal innovations. You took an approach where you brought in some of the experience of Silicon Valley, good and not good, and but what kind of lessons this brings about for a technology sector that's really on the up and up, and how everything from liability issues to intellectual property protection and data privacy, and how that all fits into this context of the AfCFTA. So, which I was thrilled. And again, now looking back over the last couple of years, it's kind of amazing to see how much has changed. I mean, we don't always get that opportunity in trade to see things changing kind of rapidly, and this agreement is really doing that. So, would love to hear your recommendations on what you think all of this tells us for the African continent, what you think maybe this tells us even globally, how you think the AfCFTA has this potential to transform. I'm always excited and thinking about too how the AfCFTA could kind of be a way to push for different international law at the global level. I mean, this is international law as well, but at the multilateral level. So tell us a little bit more about what you looked at, what you recommend, how you see all this now, and thank you for coming.
Sure.
And bringing your family too.
Yes. Brought the whole crew. Well, Professor Coleman, I kitchen sinked it, I'll say. I was thinking about everything that I could. But I want to start with why I wrote this piece from this perspective. The child goes fast, the elder goes slow, but they go far together. The African Luo version of this ubiquitous proverb unlocks my intention behind the artwork I created for the paper and my authorship of the paper itself. I am a person of African descent by way of the transatlantic slave experience. In human history, my New World Black identity is young, and African existence is our elder. But as a person of African descent, as a cosmopolitan, as a civil rights advocate, and a technology policy expert, and just as a human who's curious about the infinite experience of other humans, I know that we cannot go far without Africa, and Grandmama Africa cannot go far without us. So right now, in 2024, Africa is home to roughly 1.4 billion people and generates a gross continental product of nearly $3.1 trillion. By 2030, 6 years from now, Africa's population is expected to nearly double to over 2.5 billion people, with a gross continental product surpassing $6 trillion a year. This growth requires significant infrastructure development, including roads, railways, internet, and airports. And without infrastructure and expansion and continental cooperation, the continent will almost certainly plunge into chaos, actually. People fighting over waterways, like the Blue Nile River disputes in and around Sudan right now. Fighting over farmable land, like in the Horn of Africa and in Ghana right now. And fighting over rights to extractive resources, like in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Niger. So climate change will exacerbate, actually, these multiple simultaneous resource conflicts, such as erratic rainfall, longer dry spells, more frequent floods, that force displacement and inspire grievances over territorial boundaries. So now as I look back at my paper and the perspective, I realize even more this is why we need a African Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's a form of, as you mentioned, 54 out of 55 African countries to build a sustainable future together and to accommodate and streamline Africa's exponential population growth, surging resource needs. To boost Africa's economic growth, my suggestion is for the AfCFTA, which is the long acronym for that Continental Agreement, is to focus on creating a comprehensive telecommunications network first, right? This network should include fiber optic cables laid along the major transport routes. And by the way, this borrows from a US concept and law that I lobby on all the time, known as the dig once policy, right? As you're building things, you might as well just lay cables under the bridge or under the road. And this is essential, as well as digitizing supply chains. I think that's a very unique need, because these steps are necessary to stay updated with the movement of physical products across the entire Union area. And this will not only improve internet access, the building of these cables, but also attract investment, because businesses can track data from advertising all the way through supply chain travel. And this will generate the data needed to help customers, finance entrepreneurs, and even entice investors. Now to the legal innovations. So I was taking Professor Anupam Chander's course, who is a beloved professor here at Georgetown. And in his course, he wrote this seminal paper called How Law Made Silicon Valley. So we were thinking about how the legal regimes in the US made Silicon Valley, of course, now the number one, right, technology sector in the world, but really learning lessons from that, sitting in this class thinking about Africa, learning lessons about how we can borrow from the good and the bad lessons from the rise of Silicon Valley into now. And so particularly I think about Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which in short, which I've talked about it all night, but it balances internet platforms' liabilities for consumer actions and IP infringement. So essentially, Section 230 says platforms are not liable for any harm that users commit against other users on the platform. And the reason why it's even profitable to create a platform at all is because you're not liable for what your users do on your platform. However, people don't often read further down. That's just Section 230B, okay? But all the way down in Section 230C, there are prohibitions against copyright infringement. That is important because, you know, it's the legal framework with the copyright infringement that makes it so you can create artwork, you can create, books, songs, CDs, you can even invent things, right, and protect them. Literally either have the government enforce your protection of those things or to give you kind of a thumb on the legal scale when you go to challenge those legal questions of someone's using my song, someone's using my artwork, someone's using my invention without crediting me. And those are really important of the reason why we have so many innovations and so many companies in this country. So thinking now, right, due to the explosion of West African Afro beats, of South African Amapiano music, which I'm a huge fan of because I wanted to write about it, and Nigerian Nollywood films, or Egyptian cinema, which is absolutely exploding right now, Africa is in dire need of an IP regime that's enforceable across the entire continent and that's recognized across the world. So it has to interface with already existing intellectual property regimes in the West, in Asia, and in other parts of the world. So this would prevent the immoral extraction of African intellectual property to mirror, right, the extraction of African resources that has been happening over the last 150 years. So my recommendation, in short, was to merge the African IP laws with global standards like the WIPO and TRIPS, while tailoring them to Africa's unique needs to include traditional knowledge and resources, things that are being borrowed, right, that are not particularly encapsulated by existing IP regimes, and ensuring robust funding and enforcement for effective IP protection, right? Your IP regime is only as good as your enforcement. So I really want the African Union to think about funding and enforcement mechanism as they build it, so that we can actually get, people feeling confident in the intellectual property that they create. Last, and then I'll stop. The human rights-centered privacy regime. So one of the things, the reason for the rise of, business in the U.S. and Silicon Valley is very relaxed privacy regimes, right? Now, it's really interesting about this is I was thinking at first, I was like, if the U.S. can't even make a privacy law, this is before GDPR was even signed into law, it was passed but not yet effective. I was thinking, I bet there's no privacy law in Africa, and boy, was I wrong, right? 25 African countries, by the time I wrote this paper in 2020, had passed privacy laws. Even the African Union itself had passed a privacy law way back in 2014. So even the African Union, right, is able to come to a consensus about data privacy laws. I also work, right, in civil rights and tech, and I'm seeing the absolute worst, the Cambridge Analyticas, right, and other instances where data is being weaponized to divide a country and to upend the civil rights of some and ultimately all, right? And so I was thinking about this on a global scale and the problems with data and consumer data that can happen in Africa, and I'll say this is certainly the most controversial part of my paper. So I wrote, quote, that given the state of our world, this is all the way back before any of the conflicts we have now, I am deeply concerned about anti-democratic African and non-African governments misusing consumer data from the continent to surveil citizens of Africa, to collect revenue without consent, to target propaganda and disrupt social awareness, and to eliminate political dissent and maintain power, and to automate discrimination with artificial intelligence. That's why I recommend that the AfCFTA privacy law should require the AU to investigate and report credible allegations of war crimes to the International Criminal Court, the ICC, and then human rights violations to its universal body, the UN International Court of Justice, and also kind of create a report, sui generis, that it would send annually to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN. The aim of this is to prevent the misuse of technology and telecommunications to abuse power and violate human rights, like protecting against government misuse of consumer data for surveillance, unauthorized revenue collection, propaganda dissemination, political repression, and discriminatory practices enabled and automated against different ethnic groups by AI, ensuring that the AfCFTA's tech and telecom provisions protect both private economic interests and fundamental human rights at one time. So in conclusion, my paper, which is titled, which I forgot to give, Africa's Digital Dawn Toward an African Continental Free Tech Agreement. It's my humble contribution to Africa, the African Union's 2063 agenda. It's its 50-year kind of view of how the country wants to look then, that focuses on socioeconomic growth. Yes. And that's why I created on the front of the piece, a digital art piece called UAC Nkanea Goldwater. The artwork is a reinterpretation of the Adinkra symbol in the colors of my company, Goldwater Ventures. AUC Nkanea intentionally resembles a QR code to symbolize the technical advancement. And Goldwater is the Gullah version of my company's name, Goldwater Ventures. The piece embodies the philosophy of unity and collaboration for progress. And through this article, I seek to highlight the importance of togetherness in achieving technological advancement within Africa and international harmony led by Africa. So Professor Coleman, this is a gift for you actually, just to say thank you for your incredible leadership and for giving me the creative license to talk about Afrobeats and everything I want to talk about in your class. So thank you, Professor Coleman. Yeah.
Still have a special place in my office. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And I love